Welcome, everyone. Today we're going deep on a topic that really shakes things up, literally earthquakes.
That's right. And more specifically, how scientists figure out just how much the ground will shake during those events.
Yeah, those maps we always see on the news with all the different colors showing the shaking intensity.
Exactly. Those maps are based on some pretty complex calculations, something called ground motion prediction equations, or GMPEs for short.
GMPEs, catchy, sounds a bit like a secret code.
They kind of are. They're like this secret recipe that engineers use to design structures that can withstand those seismic surprises. And we've got a whole stack of academic papers here that delve into the nitty-gritty of these equations.
Oh, so we're going full on science nerd today. Love it.
Absolutely. But it's not just about equations and theories. These papers are packed with real-world data and insights from different regions. We've got California, Eastern North America, even the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. Each region has its own personality when it comes to earthquakes.
So, predicting how much the ground will shake isn't just about the earthquake itself, but also where you are.
Absolutely. It's like dropping a pebble in a pond versus dropping it in a bowl of Jell-O. The ripples, or in this case the seismic waves, are going to look completely different.
Gotcha. The Earth crust isn't uniform, so those waves travel and interact differently depending on the type of rock and soil they encounter.
Exactly.
Okay, before we get too deep into the Jello analogy, let's back up a bit. What exactly are these GMPEs, and why should anyone, especially someone living in, say, earthquake-prone California, care about them?
Great question. Imagine you're building a house in California. You wouldn't just use any old blueprint, would you? You'd want to know how strong the foundation needs to be, how much the walls can sway, basically how much shaking the house can handle before things start falling apart.
Right, you want to make sure it can ride out those seismic waves.
Exactly, and that's where GMPEs come in. They're like these sophisticated calculators that help engineers figure out those forces.
So they're not actually predicting when an earthquake will happen, but rather how intense the shaking will be at a particular spot.
You got it. They take into account a whole bunch of factors like the magnitude of the earthquake, the distance from the fault where it originated, and as we were just talking about, even the type of soil beneath the site.
Ah, that's why we have different papers focusing on different regions. Makes sense. So let's dive into our first paper then. We've got one by Chu and Youngs from 2014. They're focusing on California and even comparing it to regions outside Japan.
Right. What's interesting about this paper is that it's actually an update to a previous model of theirs
Yeah.
from 2008. They're adding in even more data, making the model even better.
It's like they're constantly refining the recipe, making sure the cake, or in this case, the earthquake predictions, are as good as they can be.
Exactly. And the comparison between California and non-Japanese regions is really fascinating. They're trying to see if there are any common threads in how ground motion behaves around the world.
A global perspective on shaking. Love it.
Yeah.
So I was looking through the paper, and there's this hanging wall effect they keep mentioning. What's that all about?
Oh, the hanging wall effect. Picture this.
Hmm.
You got a fault line, a giant crack in the earth. During an earthquake, one side of that fault is going to move upwards. That's the hanging wall.
Okay, so one side goes up, the other side goes down.
Yep. And here's the thing. The ground shaking on that hanging wall side, the side that moves upwards, tends to be much stronger.
Whoa, so if you're on the wrong side of the fault, things could get a lot shakier. Yikes.
It could definitely make a big difference. And Chio and Youngs are very careful to factor that into their model.
Sorry.
Yeah, which means that engineers can better predict the forces that buildings on that hanging wall side need to withstand. It's like they're giving those buildings extra muscle to handle those intense shakes.
Building muscles to fight earthquakes. Sign me up. So they're looking at the hanging wall effect, but I noticed they also mentioned the fault dip angle and the depth to the top of the rupture.
You're catching all the details they are. The dip angle is basically how steep that crack in the earth is, and the depth to the top of the rupture tells us how deep the earthquake starts.
Wow. So they're really digging deep, literally, to capture all these variables.
It is kind of like a giant underground puzzle they're trying to solve. And you know what else they consider? The type of soil. They use something called VS30, which is a way to measure how stiff or loose the ground is.
Okay, so loose soil is going to jiggle a lot more than solid rock. That makes sense. But how does that tie back to this Z1.0 thing I saw on the paper?
Good catch. Z1.0 refers to the depth at which seismic waves travel at a certain speed, 1 kilometer per second to be exact.
1 kilometer per second. That sounds fast.
It is fast. And Chiem and Youngs found that this depth can significantly impact ground motion predictions. And here's the really interesting part. They found regional differences between California and Japan in how this depth influences the shaking.
So even though we're talking about earthquakes and the ground shaking, the location really matters, like a lot.
Exactly. It's all about understanding the hidden layers beneath our feet and how they can either amplify or dampen those seismic waves.
So this Z1.0 thing, it's like a secret code for how shaky things could get in a particular spot.
That's a good way to think about it. It's another piece of that giant puzzle.
Okay, so we've got this super detailed model from Chiu and Young's focusing on California, but science is all about exploring different approaches, right? Are there other ways to predict ground motion?
Of course. And remember how we said each region has its own quirks? Well, our next set of papers, by Atkinson and Boore, shift the focus to Eastern North America. They were published in 2006 and 2008.
Eastern North America. I don't usually think of that region as earthquake country.
You're right, it doesn't have the same reputation as, say, California. But earthquakes still happen there, and they can be felt over a much wider area.
Really? Why is that?
It's all about the age and composition of the Earth's crust. Eastern North America has older, more stable crust, which means that those seismic waves can travel farther with less attenuation or weakening.
Interesting. So an earthquake of the same magnitude in Eastern North America could actually cause shaking that's felt over a wider area than on the West Coast.
That's exactly what Atkinson and Boore found. And their models take that into account, which helps engineers design structures that can withstand those unique shaking patterns.
Okay, so even though earthquakes might be less frequent in Eastern North America, we still need to take them seriously.
Absolutely. We can't be complacent no matter where we live.
Got it.
And what's really fascinating about Atkinson and Boore's work is that they use a couple of different approaches to predict ground motion. In their 2006 paper, they rely heavily on simulated ground motions using something called a stochastic finite fault approach.
Stochastic finite fault approach. That sounds pretty intense.
It is. It's basically a way of creating virtual earthquakes in a computer to study how all those complex factors like the shape and orientation of the fault breaking influence the ground shaking.
So they're running earthquake simulations. That's amazing.
It is. And it allows them to model those complex earthquake processes with a level of detail that would be difficult to achieve with real-world data alone.
Okay, so virtual earthquakes. Got it. But they don't just stick with simulations, right? I saw that their 2008 paper uses a massive database of real earthquake recordings.
Yes, they use data from the Peer NGA project, which is this huge collaborative effort to improve ground motion prediction models.
So they're combining those virtual earthquakes with real-world data.
Exactly. It's like they're taking the best of both worlds. And speaking of collaboration, the Peer NGA project involves researchers from all over the place, universities, government agencies, engineering firms, all working together to advance the science of earthquake engineering.
It's like a global brain trust focused on earthquakes.
Exactly. And it highlights something really important. We need researchers from around the world working together, sharing data, building on each other's work. Earthquakes are a global phenomenon, and tackling this challenge requires a global effort.
Makes sense. Okay, back to Atkinson and Boore. So they've got these two papers, one focused on simulations, one focused on real-world data. What's the main takeaway from their work in Eastern North America?
Well, one of the things they really emphasized is the importance of side effects. Remember how we talked about how the local conditions can amplify or de-amplify the shaking?
Like the jello versus the pond.
Exactly. And both Chiu and Young's in their 2014 paper and Atkinson and Boore in their 2008 paper really dig into the nuances of side effects.
Okay, so let's go back to Chi and Young's for a sec. What were some of their key findings about those side effects?
Well, they found that Z1.0 measurement, the depth to that specific shear wave velocity, is a key factor when it comes to side effects. And it can vary regionally, which is why they were comparing California to Japan. That depth can tell you a lot about the makeup of the soil layers and how much they might amplify the shaking during an earthquake.
Okay, so if you're building on a site with a shallow Z1.0, meaning those stiffer layers are closer to the surface, you might need to be extra careful about those potential amplified shakes.
Right. It's about understanding the ground beneath our feet. Now, Atkinson and Boore took a slightly different approach. In their 2008 paper, they incorporated a sophisticated site amplification function into their model.
Ooh, a site amplification function. That sounds fancy.
It is pretty fancy. And what makes it so special is that it takes into account not only the linear response of the soil, how it amplifies shaking in a predictable way, but also the nonlinear behavior.
Nonlinear, so it's not always going to behave in a nice, predictable way.
Not always. Think about it like jumping on a trampoline. If you jump lightly, the trampoline responds predictably. But if you jump really hard, it might bottom out, and that changes how you bounce. Soil can behave similarly during strong shaking. Atkinson and Boore recognize that and account for it in their model.
So they're giving us a more realistic picture of how a particular site might respond. That's super helpful for engineers, right?
Definitely. It can lead to safer, more resilient structures. And, it's interesting how these researchers approach complexity in their models. Sometimes they dive into all the details, like with those simulations. Other times, like with Atkinson and Bore's 2008 model, they aim for a simpler equation.
So sometimes a simpler approach can be just as effective, especially if it's easier for engineers to use.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between complexity and practicality. And, by comparing all these different approaches, we can really start to get a more comprehensive understanding of how ground motion works.
I love how this is all coming together. So we've got California, we've got Eastern North America. Are there any other regions out there doing interesting work in this field? I'm ready for another adventure.
Well, there is one paper that really stood out to me because it focuses on a very unique and challenging environment, the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal.
Oh, the Kathmandu Valley. That's a region known for its stunning beauty, but also its history of powerful earthquakes.
Hmm.
What makes it so challenging from a ground motion perspective?
The Kathmandu Valley is essentially a basin, a big bowl-shaped depression filled with layers of sediment.
So lots of soft soil.
Yep. And those sediments can significantly amplify the shaking during an earthquake.
So like a giant bowl of jello just waiting to be shaken.
That's a great way to put it. And that's the challenge that Subig Bijukchen and his colleagues tackled in their 2020 paper. They knew they couldn't just rely on those typical one-size-fits-all approaches.
So they had to get creative.
They did. They actually developed what they call a single-site GMPE for each station in the valley.
Whoa, so they're customizing their model for each location. That's dedication.
It was necessary because the geology can vary so much, even within a relatively small area like the Kathmandu Valley. And to calibrate their models, they used data from the 2015 Gorkha earthquake sequence that struck Nepal.
Ah, so real-world data from a major seismic event.
Yep. And then, get this, they took all those single-site models and generalized them to create a model that could be applied to the entire Kathmandu Valley.
So they started with the specific and then zoomed out to the general.
You got it. They incorporated bedrock depth as a key parameter in their model, essentially factoring in how deep those shaky sediments go before you hit solid ground.
It all comes back to side effects in the end, doesn't it? No matter where you are in the world, those local conditions can make a huge difference.
It's one of the fundamental principles of earthquake science. But you know what? There's another fundamental principle we haven't talked about yet.
Ooh, okay, I'm intrigued. What's this hidden layer we're about to uncover?
It's uncertainty. We can build these sophisticated models, we can incorporate tons of data, but at the end of the day, earthquakes are incredibly complex events. There's always going to be some level of uncertainty in our predictions.
So it's like trying to predict the weather. You can have all the fancy meteorological models, but sometimes Mother Nature just throws you a curveball.
A very powerful and destructive curveball in this case. But that doesn't mean we give up. It just means we need to be aware of those limitations and communicate them effectively.
Okay, so how do these researchers grapple with this uncertainty? They don't just shrug and say, well, we did our best, right?
Right. They've got some tricks up their sleeves.
Mm.
One approach is statistical analysis. They look at how much ground motion measurements from past earthquakes have varied and then use that to estimate the range of possible ground motions for future events. It's like saying, okay, based on how much things have varied in the past, here's how much they could potentially vary in the future.
It's like using the past as a guide to the future. Makes sense.
Right. And then they also incorporate something called aleatory variability.
Aleatory variability. That sounds pretty sophisticated.
It's basically the randomness inherent in earthquake processes. We can't predict exactly where a fault will rupture, how that rupture will propagate, or how the energy will be released.
Yeah.
All those unknowns contribute to variability in the ground motion.
So recognizing that there are fundamental limits to how precisely we can predict these events.
Exactly. But it doesn't stop there. There's also something called epistemic uncertainty.
Okay, 2 types of uncertainty. Fun.
I know, right? Epistemic uncertainty is about the limitations in our current knowledge and modeling techniques. But the good news is that as we learn more about earthquakes, develop new models, and collect more data, we can reduce this type of uncertainty.
So our understanding is always evolving, and there's always more to learn.
Always. And that's the beauty of science. It's a never-ending quest for knowledge.
I like that perspective. It's not about eliminating uncertainty entirely, but rather about recognizing it, quantifying it, and using it to inform our decisions. But we're not just talking about numbers and equations here, right? There's a human element to all of this.
Absolutely. These models are powerful tools, but they're not meant to replace human expertise.
So it's not just about letting the algorithms run the show.
Right. Human judgment is essential at every stage, from developing the models to interpreting the results and making decisions based on those results.
So it's like a doctor using a medical imaging device. The device provides valuable information, but it's the doctor who ultimately interprets those images and makes the diagnosis.
Perfect analogy.
So in the case of earthquakes, it's the scientists and engineers who are using these models to understand the risks, assess the vulnerabilities, and ultimately design solutions.
Exactly. They bring their knowledge of geology, seismology, engineering principles, local conditions. They use the models as guides, but they also recognize their limitations. It's a collaboration between human expertise and computational power.
A beautiful partnership. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, literally and figuratively. We've explored how scientists are using data, models, and a whole lot of brain power to predict how intensely the ground will shake during an earthquake.
Right, and we've seen how all those factors we talked about, location, soil type, bedrock depth, play a huge role. It really is like a giant interconnected puzzle.
And even with all those amazing tools and models, there's always that element of uncertainty. Earthquakes are complex, and they don't always play by the rules.
Nope, they definitely keep us on our toes.
Hmm.
But we don't let that stop us. It just means we need to be smart about how we use these tools, recognize their limitations, and communicate those uncertainties effectively.
Now I can't help but think about the practical side of all of this. Where is all this knowledge about ground motion prediction being applied?
Well, it's informing everything from building codes and infrastructure design to early warning systems and even land use planning.
So we're not just talking about theoretical knowledge here. We're talking about turning that knowledge into tangible actions that can save lives and protect property.
Absolutely. We're taking all those complex calculations and using them to build a safer, more resilient world. And that's what makes this research so exciting. It's not just about understanding the Earth. It's about using that understanding to make a positive impact.
I love that perspective. Okay, so we've talked about the science of predicting ground shaking, but it sounds like the story doesn't end there. There's a whole other layer of preparedness and action that needs to happen.
You're exactly right. We've got the knowledge, we've got the tools. Now it's about putting them into practice.
Okay, I'm ready to dive into that next layer. Let's talk about what we can actually do to prepare for those inevitable moments when the Earth decides to shake things up.
It's really a never-ending story. We're constantly trying to understand these earthquakes better, not just by refining the models, but also by improving the data that feeds into those models.
It's like having a two-pronged attack on uncertainty. Better models and better data. I like the sound of that. But what's driving those improvements in the data? Are we talking about fancier sensors or something else?
Both, actually. Think of it like baking a cake. You can have the best recipe in the world, but if you use bad ingredients, well, the cake's not going to be very good. So even with these super sophisticated GMPEs, if the data going in is bad, the predictions won't be good either.
Okay, so what are we doing to make sure we're using the best ingredients, so to speak? How are we getting better data?
One of the biggest advancements has been the increase in the number of seismic monitoring stations around the world. We've got these dense networks of sensors that capture ground motion data in amazing detail during earthquakes.
So more data points, more granular data. That definitely paints a much richer picture of how the Earth is actually moving during an earthquake.
It does. And it's not just about the quantity of data, it's about the quality too. Modern seismic sensors are incredibly sensitive and accurate. They can pick up a much broader range of frequencies, from those low-frequency rumbles that travel long distances to those high-frequency shakes that cause the most damage.
It's like we've gone from an old fuzzy radio to high-definition streaming. We're getting a much clearer signal.
Yeah, exactly. And that clearer signal is helping researchers understand all those factors that influence ground motion, things like site effects and directivity. We talked about those earlier.
Right, right. Okay, so we're collecting more data and better data. What's the payoff? How is this actually helping us prepare for earthquakes?
Well, all these advancements are feeding into things like building codes, infrastructure design, even those early warning systems. We talked about those a bit earlier too.
So it's not just theoretical knowledge. We're talking about taking that knowledge and actually turning it into actions that can save lives and protect property.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that these GMPEs aren't just used for predicting ground motion during a specific earthquake. They're also super important for something called seismic hazard assessment.
Seismic hazard assessment. Sounds a bit ominous.
It's basically a way to quantify the overall risk of earthquakes in a particular region.
So it's like a risk map for earthquakes, showing the areas that are most likely to experience strong shaking and what the potential consequences might be.
Yes, that's a good way to think about it. And those seismic hazard maps are super important. They inform all sorts of decisions, from where we choose to build to how we plan our emergency response strategies.
It's like having a roadmap to help us navigate those earthquake risks.
Exactly. It's all about making informed decisions. And, speaking of which, you mentioned the Pure NGA project earlier.
Right, the Pure NGA project. Can you remind me what that's all about?
Oh, right, yes. The Pure NGA project, it stands for Pacific Earthquake Engineering Research Center Next Generation Attenuation. It's this massive collaborative effort to develop and improve ground motion prediction models. It involves tons of people, researchers from universities, government agencies, engineering firms.
So it's like a brain trust of earthquake experts all pooling their knowledge and resources to tackle this complex problem.
That's exactly what it is. And their work has had a huge impact on our understanding of earthquakes and how to minimize their effects.
You remember those papers by Atkinson and Boore? They were part of this Pure NGA project, right?
They were contributing their expertise to this larger effort. It's like everyone's bringing something to the table.
I love that idea, a global potluck of earthquake knowledge. Okay, so we've talked about the advancements in data collection and those big collaborative projects. What about technology in general? What role is technology playing in all of this? Are there any new technologies that could revolutionize the way we study and prepare for earthquakes?
Oh yeah, technology is constantly evolving, and all those advancements are being used in earthquake science in all sorts of really exciting ways.
Okay, give me some examples. What are some of the cutting-edge technologies that are shaking things up in the world of earthquake research?
Well, one area that's really showing a lot of promise is artificial intelligence, or AI for short. Researchers are using AI to analyze these huge amounts of seismic data, looking for subtle patterns that might indicate an earthquake is coming.
So it's like having an army of digital detectives scouring the data for clues.
That's a great way to put it. And AI isn't just being used for prediction. It can also be used to improve those ground motion prediction models, to run all sorts of different earthquake scenarios, even to design more earthquake-resistant structures. It's pretty remarkable.
It sounds like AI is becoming an essential tool in the earthquake scientist's toolkit.
It is. It's really helping us unlock new insights and come up with more effective solutions.
Okay, cool. So AI is one big one. What else is out there? What other technologies are making waves in the field?
Well, another game changer has been remote sensing technologies, things like satellites and drones.
Ah, so we can get a literal bird's eye view of the Earth's behavior.
Exactly. They're being used to map fault lines, monitor ground deformation, and assess the damage after an earthquake. It gives us a whole new perspective on those complex geological processes.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, what about sensor technology itself? Any exciting new developments there?
Oh, tons. We're seeing all sorts of cool new sensors being developed. These tiny, low-cost sensors that can be deployed in huge numbers, creating these really dense monitoring networks.
So we're moving away from those big, expensive seismic stations to a more distributed, networked approach to data collection.
You got it. It's like casting a wider net, which allows us to monitor earthquakes in much greater detail and in more remote locations. It's really exciting to see how technology is transforming our understanding of earthquakes.
It sounds like we're entering a new era of earthquake science, fueled by these technological advancements. It's amazing to think about all the progress that's been made.
It is. But even with all this incredible technology, it's not just about the science. We also need to remember that there's a human element to all of this.
Right, right. It's easy to get caught up in all the cool science and technology, but at the end of the day, it's about people. It's about communities.
Absolutely. Science can give us the knowledge and the tools, but it's up to us as societies to use those tools and create a culture of preparedness.
So it's about translating that scientific knowledge into policies, regulations, community-level actions, all those things that can actually make a difference when an earthquake hits.
Exactly. It's about building codes that ensure our structures can withstand shaking, land use planning that avoids building in those high-risk areas, public education campaigns that teach people how to stay safe.
It's like we're taking all this information we've gathered about earthquakes and weaving it into the very fabric of our society.
That's a great way to put it. It's about building resilience, not just at the individual level, but at the community level, the societal level.
It's a big task, but it sounds like it's essential.
It is. And, one of the biggest challenges we face is complacency. If a region hasn't experienced a major earthquake in a while, it's easy for people to think, oh, it won't happen here, or it won't happen in my lifetime.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And that's where communication comes in. Scientists and engineers need to do a better job of explaining those risks, the uncertainties, the potential consequences of earthquakes in a way that really resonates with people.
So it's not just about publishing those research papers, it's about making that knowledge accessible and engaging for the public.
Right. We need to be telling those stories, those human stories about the impact of earthquakes and the importance of preparedness. Stories can really stick with people. They make those risks feel much more real.
Stories are powerful, and it sounds like we need to be using all the tools at our disposal to tell those stories: social media, videos, interactive maps, even virtual reality experiences.
Exactly. It's about making that connection between the science and people's everyday lives. And it's about emphasizing that we're not powerless against these forces of nature.
Yeah.
We can't prevent earthquakes, but we can take steps to reduce their impact.
I love that message. We have the power to act. We're not just passive bystanders. Okay, so we've talked about all the incredible progress in earthquake science, all the advancements in technology and data collection, but there's one big question that's still out there. Can we predict earthquakes? Is it even possible to know when and where the next big one will hit?
Ah, the million-dollar question. It's the holy grail of earthquake science. And, it's a question that's been haunting scientists for decades. We can forecast the probability of earthquakes happening in a certain region over a period of time, but we can't pinpoint exactly when or where a fault will rupture. It's like knowing a storm is brewing, but not being able to say exactly when and where it's going to make landfall.
So close, but yet so far. But are researchers even trying to crack that code? What are they looking at?
They are. They're looking at all sorts of things, like changes in animal behavior, fluctuations in groundwater levels, even those subtle shifts in electromagnetic signals.
Wow, so they're really trying to find any sign, any little hint that the Earth might be about to unleash its energy.
It's a bit like detective work,
Yeah.
trying to piece together those tiny clues.
Hmm.
And it's definitely a tough puzzle to solve. But, if we could predict earthquakes accurately, just imagine what that would mean for the world.
Yeah, it would be revolutionary.
It would. Think about being able to evacuate areas before an earthquake hits, shutting down critical infrastructure, giving people time to prepare.
It would be incredible.
It would change everything. And, we may not have achieved that level of predictive power yet, but the research continues. There are some really brilliant people out there working on this problem, and who knows, maybe someday we will crack the code.
I'm definitely rooting for them. Okay, so we've explored the science, we've marveled at the technology, we've even dipped our toes into the mysteries of earthquake prediction. What I'm really taking away from this conversation is that it's not just about the science, it's about people, it's about communities, it's about building a more resilient world together.
You're absolutely right. We can have all the knowledge in the world, but if we don't put it into action, it won't do much good. So let's shift gears a bit and talk about what we can actually do to prepare for those inevitable moments when the Earth decides to shake things up a bit.
It really feels like we've come full circle. We started by talking about all those complex calculations, all that amazing science.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it all comes down to what we actually do to prepare, right? It's about taking action.
Absolutely. It's about turning all those insights, all those scientific discoveries into actions that can actually make a difference when an earthquake hits.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks here. What are some of the things that people can do, practical steps to get ready for an earthquake? I'm imagining earthquake drills, emergency kits, stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. Those are all really great starting points. Having a plan, knowing what to do when the shaking starts, that can make a huge difference in staying safe. But, it goes beyond just those individual actions. We also need to be thinking about community-level initiatives, policies that create a culture of resilience.
So it's not just about what I do in my own home. It's about what we do as a neighborhood, as a city, as a society.
Exactly. It's about working together to create a safer, more resilient world. Think about building codes, for example.
Okay, building codes. What about them?
Well, if we have stronger building codes, codes that are informed by the latest research on ground motion prediction, that can make a huge difference in how well structures hold up during earthquakes.
So those calculations we were talking about earlier, all that science, it's actually being used to design buildings that can ride out those seismic waves.
It is. And it's not just about making buildings strong, it's also about making them flexible.
Yeah.
Giving them the ability to move with those tremors, kind of like a tree swaying in the wind.
Ah, okay. So it's about being strong and flexible.
Yeah.
Got it. So building codes are important. What other kinds of policies are we talking about?
Land use planning is a big one. We need to be smart about where we build. Avoiding those high-risk areas, like places with soft soil that can amplify the shaking, that can really reduce the potential for damage.
It's like choosing the right foundation for your house. You wouldn't want to build on shaky ground, literally.
Exactly. And then there's the whole public awareness piece. Educating people about earthquake risks, teaching them what to do during and after an earthquake, doing those drills we talked about. All of that plays a huge role.
So it's about empowering people with the knowledge and the skills they need to stay safe.
Yes. And it's not just about adults. We need to be teaching kids about earthquakes from a young age, making it part of their everyday awareness.
So it becomes second nature, like looking both ways before you cross the street.
Exactly. Building that earthquake-aware culture, starting young, can make a huge difference.
This all sounds great in theory, but I imagine it's not always easy to implement these policies and actually change people's behavior.
You're right, there are definitely challenges. Complacency is a big one. If a region hasn't experienced a major earthquake in a long time, it can be really hard to get people to take it seriously.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind.
Exactly. And that's why communication is so important. Scientists and engineers, they need to do a better job of explaining those risks, the uncertainties, the potential consequences. They need to make it real for people.
So it's not just about publishing research paper, it's about connecting with people, making that knowledge accessible.
Exactly. We need to tell those stories, those human stories, about the impact of earthquakes. Stories are powerful. They make those risks feel much more real.
I love that idea, using stories to connect with people. And we have so many tools at our disposal these days: social media, videos, interactive maps. We can even create virtual reality experiences to bring those stories to life.
Exactly. It's about being creative, about finding those ways to engage people and make it relevant to their lives. And it's about emphasizing that we're not helpless. We can't stop earthquakes from happening, but we can take steps to minimize the damage.
I love that. It's a message of hope and empowerment. Okay, so wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the science of predicting ground motion, the challenges of uncertainty, the amazing advancements in technology.
Right.
But I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is this idea of preparedness. We can't just sit back and wait for an earthquake to happen. We need to take action.
Absolutely. We need to be proactive.
And that action needs to happen at all levels, from individual preparedness, like having those emergency kits and plans, to community-level initiatives like strengthening building codes and raising public awareness. It's about building a culture of resilience.
I completely agree. It's about working together, sharing knowledge, supporting each other. We can't do this alone.
I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today.
I hope so.
We've shown them the amazing world of earthquake science, all those complex calculations and cutting-edge technologies that are helping us understand these powerful forces of nature. But more importantly, we've shown them that we're not powerless. We have the power to prepare, to act, to make a difference.
We do. Knowledge is power.
So the next time you hear about an earthquake on the news, or maybe even feel a little tremor under your feet, remember that we're not just passive observers in all of this. We have the ability to understand, to prepare, to build a more resilient future.
Yes. We have the power to create a world where earthquakes, while inevitable, no longer have the power to devastate our communities.
That's a future worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating world of earthquake science and preparedness. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay resilient.